a ship of that size should not sink because it had a fire on board. Its fire control measures should be such that wherever the fire was, it could be dealt with. No, the Russian line on this is a load of baloney.
Russia's Black Sea flagship has sunk. Moscow claims a fire on board caused ammunition to detonate, but officials in Ukraine insist they struck the Moskva with missiles. Western intelligence is yet to confirm the details. As the war in Ukraine continues, today's Times reports British troops are training on the Russian border and are 100% prepared for an escalation of the conflict. Lord Richard Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff, joins us now. Good morning to you.
Hi, good morning.
First of all, the sinking of the Moskva, how significant is it?
Well, I think it's very significant. The fact the Russians are dismissing it and saying there was a fire on board and so it sank. Well, look, I'm a general, not an admiral, but a ship of that size should not sink because it had a fire on board. Its fire control measures should be such that wherever the fire was, it could be dealt with. No, the Russian line on this is a load of baloney. Undoubtedly, the Ukrainians attacked it with some kind of shorter ship missile and sank the Black Sea flagship. That's huge. And once again, well done to the Ukrainians, and how embarrassing for the Russians.
And with that in mind, what is your assessment, first of all, of the Russian campaign to take the Black Sea coast, but also the Donbass region? What's your assessment of how things are looking at the moment?
Well, let's just stay with the coast for a moment. I think we have to assume that Mariupol will fall quite soon. The Ukrainian fighters that have been holding out there have done an incredible job over an extended period of time, but I think it is only a matter of time and Mariupol will fall. So that does mean that Russia has achieved the aim of establishing a land corridor from Crimea through the coastline, through Mariupol, up to the Donbass region. And undoubtedly, that's been one of their strategic objectives. But and this is where coming back to the Moskva is so interesting. For the Russians to really achieve control of that coastline, they've got to take the port of Odessa as well. Now, for Ukraine, Odessa is really, really important as the last port onto the high seas in order to get their exports out. So undoubtedly, Ukraine will fight really hard to keep control of Odessa. And the loss of the Moskva is really significant in terms of denting the Russians' enthusiasm and ability to attack Odessa. But then come to the Donbass region itself more properly. Again, one of the Russian principal strategic objectives is to take complete control of Donetsk and Luhansk province. And there is no doubt, and the intelligence is very clear, that the Russians are building up significant forces at some point in the near future to launch a significant attack to try and secure both of those provinces. Whether they will achieve that or not, time will tell. The Ukrainians will undoubtedly fight extraordinarily hard and quite sensibly are standing on what I would call the strategic defensive in well-prepared positions to allow the Russians to throw themselves against those positions. And the laws of war are such that the attacker invariably takes much heavier casualties than the defenders. And that's, I think, what we'll see happen over the next few days, week or two.
Lord Dannatt, give us your assessment of what morale must be like among the Russian troops. You've got the sinking of the Moskva. You've got 40 generals at the latest count to have died in this conflict. They lost the initiative in the initial days of the invasion and have had to scale back their plans for taking over the entire country. Do you think it will be a struggle to lift the morale of Russian troops at the moment?
Well, I'm sure it will be. I think you've got two sides of the coin as far as morale is concerned. Ukrainian morale is extremely high. They are defying the odds. They're doing extremely well. After all, they're defending their own homeland and their own values. And then the Russians, well, depends on what they've been told. It also depends on what individual soldiers' experiences have been. But there is no doubt that the evidence is compelling, is very clear, that the Russian forces have taken a huge number of casualties, a large number of senior leaders, as you mentioned, possibly up to 40 senior officers have lost their lives. Others, we're told, have been removed from their posts for being non-effective. I think the Russian chain of command has got a huge problem to motivate its units to come up with a sensible battle plan. The only thing that's in their favor is that General Alexander Dornikov is now in command. He has a pretty fearsome reputation of having been in command in Syria, where, frankly, the laws of war were not followed at all, that he, I think, will probably try and whip into some form of shape the Russian forces before they launch their offensive, which, as I said before, we all expect to be launched quite soon.
Meanwhile, British troops are expanding their presence in Estonia, close to the Russian border. Is that a sensible precaution, or is this a preparation for potentially open conflict?
No, it's not the latter. It is a sensible precautionary deployment, and it recognises the fact that a country like Estonia is a member of NATO, and that all members of NATO stand shoulder to shoulder with each other. And we've had long-standing arrangements, training with the Estonians and supporting Estonia. And Britain in recent weeks has doubled the size, or significantly increased the size, of its forward deployment in Estonia. I understand there are 48 Warrior infantry fighting vehicles and 24 Challenger main battle tanks, supported by some Apache helicopters as well. So it's a significant deployment showing solidarity with one of our NATO partners, which shares a border with Russia, and quite rightly, with a backward glance at history, has got a pretty patchy record of it in its relations with Russia. But it's a deterrent deployment. It is not a preparation for general war, but should. And this is an interesting point, actually. What it is to me, what Putin was saying before he attacked Russia, before he attacked Ukraine, was that he also wanted to roll back NATO presence in countries like Estonia, even threatening that he might attack them. Well, frankly, his military has expended itself in Ukraine, and I think that threat of him widening the war has probably largely gone.
General Sir Richard Sheriff, former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe, told this programme that he thinks NATO needs to be preparing for war with Russia. Would you agree?
Well, Richard Sheriff has long thought that NATO would find itself fighting a war with Russia. Indeed, he wrote a book saying we'd be fighting war with Russia in 2017. So he's been very much of that view for quite some time. The whole point of NATO is to be prepared to defend Western Europe and Western freedom. And therefore, quite properly, NATO should be preparing for that kind of conflict. Do I think it's likely? No, I don't. What is much more important is that we go on supporting Ukraine, both with the sanctions that are being levied on Russia, supplying Ukraine with the maximum amount of modern high-tech military equipment, and supporting them every which way we can. Ukraine, as we all know, is not a NATO member. So while we're supporting them, we want to keep this limited war contained within Ukraine and avoid that possibility of it spilling out in the way that we were just describing to somewhere like Estonia or Poland, or indeed, what's also interesting, of course, is that Finland and Sweden are now seriously considering joining NATO. But we do want to make sure that by being prepared to fight a war, we don't actually have to fight a war. So Richard Sheriff is right to talk about it, but do I think it'll happen? No, it won't. And it won't happen because NATO is properly prepared to deter that, and that's really important.
And finally, Lord Dannatt, the Defence Review, published in March 2021, said the army will be cut to 72,500 troops by 2025. The army has been facing cuts for years. Given what we now know about the real threat from Russia, we do need tanks, we need infantry, don't we? How much more do you think the government needs to give the army to keep us safe?
Well, I think the integrated review, as you say, published a year ago, has proven that it got some of the calculations wrong. This tilt towards Asia Pacific clearly is not the right tilt to have made, given we've now got a land war in Europe. And given we've got a land war in Europe, it's disappointing that the army, amongst our three armed forces, has been the lowest priority for investment in recent years. So that's got to change. And the size of the army that's projected is not large enough for the range of commitments we're likely to have in the future. I think the defence budget needs to be raised to 2.5% to 3% of GDP. That's another 10 to 12 billion pounds a year. And there needs to be some serious investment into the army. Interestingly, again, well, it's interesting to me, I mentioned just now that there were 48 Warrior infantry fighting vehicles in Estonia. The current plan is to take all those infantry fighting vehicles out of service. Now, that has to be a decision that is revisited again. If we want to have a meaningful armoured capability that could manoeuvre on land, then we need to have main battle tanks like the Challenger. We need to have tracked infantry fighting vehicles like Warrior and not take them out of service and put a wheeled variant in its place. That just won't fly. So the point is, the army is not large enough. It's got to be invested in much more seriously. Another 10 to 12 billion pounds needs to go into the defence budget.
Lord Dannatt, Richard Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff, Head of the British Army, thank you so much for joining us.